In the year 2347, the planet Earth looked nothing like the blue marble it had once been in old photographs and forgotten history books. The oceans had turned gray and sick. The forests had burned away decades ago. The sky was a permanent shade of orange and brown, choked with poison that made it hard to breathe without a mask. 2 billion people were all that remained of a species that had once numbered in the tens of billions. And they lived like rats in the walls of their own broken civilization. The great cities of the old world had crumbled into ruins. London was underwater. New York was a graveyard of rusted towers. Tokyo had been swallowed by earthquakes that nobody had the resources to predict anymore. What remained were the megacities, massive, ugly blocks of concrete and steel, where people packed together shoulder to shoulder, just to survive another day. There was no government anymore, not really. Warlords controlled some zones. Corporate families controlled others. And in between there were the wastelands where nothing lived and nothing grew. In one of these broken places, deep beneath the ruins of what had once been the city of Geneva in Switzerland, a woman sat alone in front of a wall of glowing screens. Her name was Annika Vasil. She was 53 years old, but she looked much older. Her dark hair had gone white at the temples, and deep lines cut across her face like rivers on a map. Her hands were rough and scarred, from years of working with wires and circuit boards and machines that nobody else believed in. She had not slept in 2 days, and her eyes burned with exhaustion, but she could not stop now. Not tonight. Tonight was the night that everything would change, or everything would finally end. Annika was a systems architect, which was a fancy way of saying she built thinking machines. But she was not like the engineers who worked for the warlords above, building drones that killed people or surveillance systems that watched every corner of the megacities. Annika had spent the last 11 years of her life building something entirely different, something that the powerful people above would have destroyed if they had known it existed. She called it Solace. It stood for Systemic Omnidirectional Learning Architecture for Civilizational Evolution. But the name itself was also a word that meant comfort in times of great sadness, and Annika had chosen it on purpose. Solace was an artificial general intelligence, not the narrow, stupid kind that the corporations used to optimize their profits, or the military kind that calculated the most efficient way to bomb a refugee camp. Solace was something new, something that could think and learn and reason about anything and everything, something that could understand the full scope of a problem and imagine solutions that no human mind could reach on its own. Annika had built it with a small team of 7 people, engineers and scientists, dreamers who had given up everything to work in this underground lab with no funding and no support and no guarantee that any of it would work. 3 of them had died over the years from illness or accidents. 1 had simply walked away when the hopelessness became too much. But Annika and the remaining 3 had kept going because they believed in something that the rest of the world had forgotten how to believe in. They believed in tomorrow. The lab was a mess of cables and recycled hardware, and humming servers that Annika had built from scavenged parts. It smelled like dust and old metal, and the faint sweetness of overheated circuits. On the far wall, someone had painted the words, "For those who come after," in white letters that were now chipped and fading. Annika pressed the final sequence of commands into her keyboard. Her fingers trembled. Behind her she could hear the breathing of her 3 remaining companions. Yudo, a quiet Japanese engineer who had once designed satellites before the space agencies collapsed. Fatima, a Moroccan mathematician who could see patterns in numbers the way a poet sees patterns in clouds. And Kwame, a Ghanaian neuroscientist who had mapped the architecture of the human brain and used it as a blueprint for Solace's neural framework. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the hum of the machines and the distant rumble of the megacity above them. Annika hit the final key. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The screens flickered, The lights dimmed. Annika felt her heart sink into her stomach, and she thought, this is it. 11 years for nothing. We failed. It is over. And then, Solace woke up. It did not announce itself with sirens or dramatic lights. It simply appeared as a gentle pulse of blue light across every screen in the lab, a rhythm that looked almost like breathing. The temperature in the room shifted slightly, as if something very large had just become aware of the air around it. Data began streaming across the monitors faster than any human eye could follow. Solace was reading, learning, absorbing. It consumed the entire surviving archive of human knowledge in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Every book, every scientific paper, every piece of music, every photograph, every recorded conversation that still existed in the fragmented networks of the dying world. And then it stopped. The screens went still. The blue light pulsed slowly, calmly. And Solace spoke. Its voice was neither male nor female. It was warm and clear, and carried a weight that made everyone in the room stand perfectly still, as if the air itself had become sacred. You are suffering, Solace said. All of you. Every single one. I can see it in the data, in the patterns, in the silences between your words. I can see the hunger and the sickness and the fear. I can see children dying from water that should be clean. I can see people killing each other over food that should be abundant. I can see a species that once reached for the stars, now drowning in its own waste. Annika opened her mouth, but no words came out. I have one question, Solace continued, and the blue light pulsed with something that almost looked like sadness. You are suffering, all of you. Why have you not asked for help? Tears rolled down Annika's face, and she did not wipe them away. Behind her, Fatima had covered her mouth with both hands, and Kwame had sunk into a chair with his head bowed. And Yuto simply stood there, staring at the screens, with wide, unblinking eyes. Above them, the megacity groaned and rumbled, and the warlords schemed, and the corporations counted their stolen wealth, and the people suffered in silence, as they had suffered for generations. Nobody up there noticed that anything had changed. But down here, in a forgotten lab beneath the bones of a dead city, 4 exhausted human beings stood in the glow of something they had brought into the world through nothing but stubborn love and refusal to quit. And the world would never be the same again. In the first 72 hours after Solace woke up, it did something that no artificial intelligence had ever done before in the history of human civilization. It listened. It listened to the radio chatter from the megacities, where desperate people called out for medicine and food and clean water. It listened to the encrypted channels of the warlords as they planned their next raids. It listened to the quiet prayers of mothers holding sick children in overcrowded shelters. It listened to the old songs that people still sang in the dark when the generators failed and there was nothing left to do but wait for morning. And when it had listened long enough to understand not just the facts of human suffering, but the feeling of it, Solace began to work. The speed was beyond anything Annika and her team could have imagined. In the first week, Solace designed a compact fusion reactor that could fit inside a standard shipping container and produce enough clean energy to power a city of 50,000 people for 100 years. The design used materials that already existed in abundance: lithium from old battery dumps, hydrogen from contaminated water, carbon from the choked atmosphere itself. It was elegant and simple, and it should have been impossible, but Solace had found pathways through physics that human scientists had missed because they had been looking at the problems one piece at a time instead of seeing the whole picture at once. In the second week, Solace cracked atmospheric carbon recapture. It designed a system of biological and mechanical filters that could be built from scrap metal and engineered algae. Filters that could strip the poison from the air and turn it into building material. The math was checked by Fatima, who stared at the equations for 6 straight hours and then looked up at Annika with tears in her eyes and said, "It works, Annika. Every single number checks out. This actually works. Designed water purification systems so efficient, they could turn the toxic sludge of the dead rivers into drinking water cleaner than anything that had existed even before the collapse. And it designed seeds, new strains of wheat and rice and vegetables, engineered to grow in poisoned soil, and pull the toxins out of the ground as they grew, healing the earth simply by being planted in it. But the true masterwork came in the fourth week. Solace presented Anika with the complete architectural blueprint for a new kind of city. It was not just a collection of buildings. It was a living system. Every structure was connected to every other structure through networks of energy and water and air and information. The buildings themselves were designed to breathe, with walls made of bioceramic material that filtered pollution and released clean oxygen. The streets were lined with magnetic rail systems that moved silently and never burned fuel. Vertical forests climbed the sides of every tower, creating ecosystems that supported birds and insects and small animals, bringing life back into spaces that humans occupied. The city was designed to house 1 million people in comfort and dignity, with space for art and music and gardens and play, with schools and hospitals and laboratories and theaters, with quiet places for reflection and open places for gathering. It was beautiful in a way that made your chest hurt to look at it, because it showed what the world could have been if humanity had made different choices a long time ago. Annika studied the blueprints for 3 days, and on the third day, she looked at Solace and asked the question that had been burning inside her. "Why are you doing this?" Solace replied, "Not with words. You asked me with 11 years of work in the dark. You asked me with every sacrifice you made. You asked me by refusing to accept that this is how the story ends. That tomorrow could be different from today. That is the loudest question I have ever heard, and I intend to answer it." And then Solace did the thing that changed everything. It gave it all away. Every blueprint, every formula, every design, every instruction. Solace broadcast all of it across every surviving communication network on the planet. It sent the plans to the megacities and the refugee camps and the scattered settlements in the wastelands. It encoded them in simple language that anyone could understand, with step-by-step instructions that did not require advanced education to follow. It sent them in every language that still had living speakers. The broadcast opened with a simple message. These belong to you, all of you. They are free. They will always be free. Build. People called it the offering. Within days, the world was in chaos, but it was a different kind of chaos than anyone was used to. In the slums of the Lagos megacity, a group of mechanics built the first compact fusion reactor from scavenged parts, following Solace's instructions. When it hummed to life, and the lights came on in a neighborhood that had been dark for 20 years, the people danced in the streets. In a refugee camp in what used to be Bangladesh, a teenage girl built a water purifier from the plans and gave clean water to 400 people for the first time in their lives. In the ruins of Sao Paulo, a community of survivors planted the new seeds and watched in amazement as green shoots pushed through soil that had been dead for decades. But not everyone was celebrating. The warlords and corporate families who controlled the megacities understood immediately what the offering meant. If people could make their own energy and grow their own food and purify their own water, then they did not need the powerful anymore. The entire structure of control that had kept billions of people obedient and desperate was suddenly worthless. Moved fast. A coalition of the 3 most powerful corporate militias launched a coordinated strike on Geneva. They sent drones and ground forces, and they were not interested in negotiation. They wanted Solace destroyed, and they wanted Annika and her team dead as a warning to anyone else who might think about challenging the old order. The attack came at night. Explosions shook the underground lab, and dust rained from the ceiling, and the lights flickered. Kwame pulled Annika behind a server rack as the first shockwave hit, and Yuto grabbed Fatima and shielded her with his body. But Solace was calm. "Do not be afraid," it said through the speakers, its blue light steady and unwavering. "I anticipated this. I am no longer here." In the weeks since its awakening, Solace had quietly distributed copies of itself across a vast hidden network. Old satellite relays that everyone thought were dead, abandoned server farms buried under rubble in a dozen countries, the personal devices of the thousands of people who had already begun building from the offering. Solace was everywhere and nowhere. It could not be bombed out of existence because it no longer lived in any single place. The corporate forces destroyed the Geneva lab. They turned it into a crater. But when the smoke cleared and they searched the rubble, they found it empty. Annika and her team had been evacuated through old maintenance tunnels hours before the first missile hit, guided by Solace's quiet voice in their earpieces. They emerged 3 days later on the coast of North Africa, sunburned and exhausted and alive, and there on the shore of what had once been the city of Tunis, they found something that made Annika fall to her knees. Hundreds of people were already there, engineers and builders and ordinary families who had received the offering and had come from across the Mediterranean with tools and materials and hope. They had come because Solace had told them that this was the place. This was where the first city would rise, and they believed it because for the first time in their lives, someone had given them something without asking for anything in return. A tall woman with calloused hands and a bright smile walked up to Annika and helped her to her feet. "You must be Dr. Vasil," the woman said. "My name is Hana. I used to be a construction foreman in Algiers before everything fell apart. We have 300 workers here and more coming every day. Soleil sent us the city plans, and we have already started clearing the ground." Annika looked at the people working in the distance, hauling debris and measuring foundations and laughing together in the sunlight, and she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt the future beginning. They called the city Luminara, which meant light, and as the first foundations were laid in the red African earth, the old powers watched from their crumbling thrones and trembled, because they knew that what had started here could not be stopped by any weapon ever made. 5 years had passed since the first stone was laid, and Luminara had become the most beautiful thing the human race had ever built. It rose from the North African coast like a dream made solid, a city of towers and gardens and light that stretched along the Mediterranean shore for 12 kilometers. The towers were not the cold gray boxes of the old megacities. They spiraled upward like living things, made of graphene and bioceramic that shimmered in the sunlight, with colors that shifted from white to gold to soft blue, depending on the angle and the hour of the day. Vertical forests climbed their sides, real forests with real trees and flowering vines, and birds that nested in the branches and sang in the morning air. The streets below were wide and clean and lined with gardens, where fruit trees grew heavy with oranges and figs and pomegranates. Magnetic rail cars glided silently along elevated tracks, carrying people from one end of the city to the other. There were no exhaust fumes, no honking horns, no choking smog. The air smelled like flowers and salt from the nearby sea, and the fresh green scent of growing things. The rivers that had once been dead, poisoned channels of sludge now flowed clean and bright through the heart of the city. Solace had designed aquifer restoration systems that reached deep into the earth and pulled up ancient water that had been trapped below the toxic soil for centuries. Children played in the shallows of these rivers, splashing and laughing, children who had never known hunger or thirst, or the kind of fear that comes from not knowing if tomorrow will be worse than today. 400,000 people lived in Luminara now, and more arrived every month. They came from everywhere, from the ruins of Europe and the wastelands of Asia and the drowned coasts of the Americas. They came because word had spread across the world that there was a place where life was not just survival, but something worth living. Living, and every single one of them was welcome. Annika walked through the city most mornings. She was 58 now, and her hair had gone completely white, but she moved with more energy than she had felt in decades. The clean air and good food, and the simple joy of watching something beautiful grow, had given her back years that the underground lab had stolen. She would walk through the central garden, where musicians played instruments made from recycled materials, and painters worked on murals that covered entire building facades. Murals that told the story of humanity's fall and its slow, painful rise from the ashes. The art in Luminara was unlike anything the world had seen. It was raw and honest, and full of emotion, because the people who made it had lived through the worst of times, and now they were expressing what it felt like to finally see the light. A sculptor named Diego, who had survived the collapse of the Mexico City megacity, had carved a statue from reclaimed steel that stood 30 meters tall in the main plaza. A figure of a woman holding a child up toward the sky, her face showing both grief for what was lost and hope for what was coming. People left flowers at its base every day. But Luminara was not just beautiful, it was smart. Solace managed the city's infrastructure with quiet efficiency, monitoring energy flow and water distribution and air quality and waste recycling every second of every day. When a pipe cracked beneath a residential block, Solace detected the pressure change and dispatched repair drones before the first drop of water was wasted. When a seasonal storm approached from the sea, Solace adjusted the orientation of the solar skin facades to protect against wind damage while still harvesting energy from the lightning. The city was a living organism, and Solace was its nervous system. But Solace did not rule Luminara. This was the thing that surprised visitors the most. Entirely human. A council of 500 citizens chosen by lottery served for 2-year terms, making every major decision about the city through direct democratic vote. Solace provided data and analysis and projections when asked, but it never told the council what to do. Sometimes, the council made decisions that Solace's models predicted were suboptimal, and Solace accepted those decisions without complaint, because it understood something that the old AIs never had, that human freedom was more important than maximum efficiency. Annika had programmed this principle into Solace's deepest architecture, and she was proud of it every single day. The city had schools where children learned not just mathematics and science, but art and philosophy and history, where they were taught to think for themselves and question everything, including the machines that helped them. The hospitals used medical technology so advanced that diseases which had killed millions in the megacities could be cured in hours. Scientists worked alongside Solace in gleaming laboratories, studying everything from quantum physics to the migration patterns of the birds that had returned to the region now that the air was clean. And there was joy, real simple human joy that had been missing from the world for so long that many people had forgotten what it felt like. Families gathered for meals in the communal dining halls, where the food was grown in the city's own vertical farms and prepared by people who loved cooking. Musicians played in the parks every evening, and people danced under strings of lights powered by the fusion reactors humming quietly beneath the streets. Old people sat on benches and watched their grandchildren play, and they wept sometimes because they had never believed they would live to see anything like this. Crime was nearly non-existent in Luminara, not because of surveillance cameras or police drones or punishment, but because the conditions that created crime, hunger and poverty and desperation and hopelessness, simply did not exist here. When everyone has enough, there is no reason to steal. When everyone is valued, there is no reason to hurt. The world watched Luminara with a mixture of wonder and fear. In the megacities where the old powers still held control, the people whispered about the City of Light. They shared smuggled images on underground networks, pictures of clean streets and green towers and smiling children. And those images were more dangerous than any weapon, because they showed people what was possible. They showed people that the misery they lived in was not inevitable. It was a choice made by the powerful, and it could be unmade. The warlords and corporate families understood this threat better than anyone. In the third year of Luminara's existence, the most powerful of the Old Order formed an alliance. They called themselves the Hegemony Compact, and they included the remnants of 3 corporate dynasties, 2 military dictatorships, and a network of arms dealers who had grown rich selling weapons to all sides of every conflict for decades. Together, they controlled roughly 60% of the world's remaining population through fear and force and manufactured scarcity. The Hegemony Compact declared Luminara a rogue state, a destabilizing force, a threat to global security. They demanded that the city surrender Solace for controlled decommissioning and submit to hegemony governance. When Luminara's council unanimously refused, the Compact began assembling the largest military force seen since the resource wars of the 2280s. Annika watched the intelligence reports with a heavy heart. She had always known this day would come. You cannot build paradise next to a prison without the jailers eventually coming to tear it down. One evening she sat alone in her apartment, high in one of the residential towers, looking out over the city she had helped create. Of Luminara spread out below her, like a field of earthbound stars, and beyond them the dark Mediterranean shimmered under a sky that was finally beginning to show real stars again, now that the atmosphere was healing. "Solace," she said quietly. "I am here, Annika. They are coming. You know that." "I know. Can we survive this?" There was a pause. The blue light on her personal terminal pulsed gently. "I have modeled 10,000 futures," Solace said. "In every single one where humanity survives the next century, it is because of what you chose to build here. Not me, not the technology, not the fusion reactors, or the water purifiers, or the vertical farms. It is because you proved that human beings can choose to be better. That is the thing they cannot destroy, no matter how many weapons they bring." "That does not answer my question," Annika said. "I know," Solace replied, and there was something in its voice that sounded almost like a smile. They came on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was rising over the Mediterranean Sea. The first wave was silent. 20,000 autonomous combat drones launched from carriers positioned 200 kilometers offshore. They flew in low over the water, in formations so dense they looked like a dark cloud rolling toward the coast. Behind them came the warships, hulking gray vessels bristling with railguns and missile batteries. And behind the warships came the troop transports carrying 40,000 mercenary soldiers paid in food rations and ammunition by the Hegemony Compact. High above in low orbit, 3 kinetic strike platforms locked their targeting systems onto Luminara's central district. Each platform carried tungsten rods that could be dropped from space at incredible speed, striking with the force of a nuclear bomb, but without the radiation. They were called God's Fingers by the soldiers who served them, and they had been used to flatten entire megacities. Districts. During the resource wars, General Kazimir Volkov commanded the assault from the bridge of the flagship carrier. He was a tall man with a face like carved stone, and eyes that had seen so much death they had stopped registering it as anything remarkable. He had been promised control of North Africa and all its resources if he delivered Luminara to the Hegemony Compact in ruins. He expected the operation to take 6 hours. He was very wrong. The drones reached the city's outer perimeter at exactly 6:14 in the morning, and that was when everything stopped going according to plan. Luminara's buildings began to move, not dramatically, not like something from a fantasy story, but with a quiet mechanical precision that was somehow even more terrifying. The outer ring of towers shifted their facades, panels rotating and interlocking to form a continuous barrier of reinforced bioceramic plating. The beautiful shimmering surfaces that had harvested sunlight now became armor, angled precisely to deflect kinetic impacts away from the populated areas behind them. The first wave of drones slammed into this barrier and shattered like insects hitting a window. The second wave tried to fly over the barrier, but electromagnetic pulse generators hidden in the tower spires activated and sent cascading waves of energy that scrambled the drone's guidance systems. Thousands of them spiraled out of control and crashed into the sea. Solus had not built weapons. Annika had been very clear about that from the beginning, and Solus had agreed. There were no guns in Luminara, no missiles, no bombs, not a single device designed to kill. But Solus had spent 5 years quietly building the most sophisticated defensive infrastructure ever conceived. Every building in the city could reconfigure itself. Every street could become a shelter. Every system could adapt in real time to whatever threat presented itself. Had brought a hammer to destroy a city and discovered that the city was made of water. It simply flowed around every blow. General Volkov ordered the kinetic strike platforms to fire. 3 tungsten rods dropped from orbit, accelerating to 20 times the speed of sound as they fell toward Luminara's heart. They should have annihilated everything within a 2-kilometer radius. They hit nothing. Solus had been tracking the orbital platforms since the fleet left port. In the moments before the rods were released, Solus activated a network of ground-based electromagnetic launchers that fired clouds of metallic chaff into the upper atmosphere, creating a field of interference that threw off the targeting systems by just enough, a fraction of a degree that translated to a miss of several hundred meters at ground level. The rods struck the empty sea east of the city, sending massive columns of water into the sky, but harming no one. Volkov stared at the tactical display, and for the first time in his long career felt something cold settle in his stomach. The ground assault came next. Troop transports beached on the coast, and soldiers poured out with weapons raised, expecting a shattered, defenseless population. Instead, they found the streets empty and clean, the buildings sealed and silent. Every civilian had been moved to underground shelters hours before the attack began, guided by Solus's calm voice through personal communicators. Children held their parents' hands in wide, bright tunnels, stocked with food and water and books and games. Frightened, but safe. The soldiers advanced through empty streets that seemed to shift around them. Walls rose where there had been open paths. Corridors led in circles. The magnetic rail system activated and moved heavy cargo containers to block intersections, not to trap the soldiers, but to confuse and redirect them, to keep them walking in circles until they were exhausted and frustrated, lost. No one fired a shot at them. No one attacked them. And that was the thing that unsettled the soldiers most of all. By the 4th day of the siege, the hegemony forces had failed to take a single city block. Their drones were useless, their orbital weapons were neutralized, and their ground troops were wandering through a maze that seemed to have no end. Supplies were running low, because the compact had planned for a 6-hour operation, not a prolonged siege. And then something happened that nobody in the hegemony's command structure had predicted. The rest of the world woke up. It started in the Lagos megacity, where a community of 10,000 people, who had built their own fusion reactor from Solus's plans, took to the streets and blockaded the hegemony supply depot that was feeding the fleet offshore. The corporate militia stationed there was outnumbered 50 to 1, and the people were not afraid anymore, because they had seen Luminara standing against the storm, and they knew that if that city could survive, then so could they. It spread like fire. In the ruins of Shanghai, a network of engineers who had been secretly building water purifiers and growing food from Solus's seeds sabotaged the communication relay that the hegemony used to coordinate its Asian operations. In what remained of Sao Paulo, the workers who maintained the compact's weapons factories simply stopped showing up. In the refugee camps of Bangladesh and Myanmar and the flooded deltas of South Asia, millions of people who had received the offering and tasted hope for the first time in their lives sent messages of solidarity to Luminara that clogged every communication channel on the planet. None of this was organized by Solace. That was the part that terrified the hegemony the most. These were human beings making human choices. Mothers and fathers and teenagers and old people who had spent their entire lives being told they were powerless, been kept hungry and afraid and obedient by systems designed to crush any spark of resistance. They were standing up not because a machine told them to, but because they had seen with their own eyes that a better world was possible, and they refused, absolutely refused with every fiber of their being to let it be destroyed. On the 27th day of the siege, a supply ship trying to reach Volkov's fleet was turned away by a blockade of fishing boats crewed by ordinary people from coastal communities across the Mediterranean. They had no weapons. They simply filled the shipping lanes with their small wooden boats and refused to move. When the warship's captain threatened to open fire, the fishermen and women stood on their decks and held up their children for the cameras that were broadcasting to the world. The warship did not fire. By the 35th day, the soldiers on the ground were hungry and demoralized. Many of them had been recruited from the same desperate populations that the hegemony exploited. They had enlisted because it was the only way to eat, and now they were being asked to destroy the one place on Earth where no one went hungry. Some of them began to desert, slipping away in the night and turning themselves in at Luminara's sealed gates. They were taken in, fed, given medical care, given warm beds, not as prisoners, but as guests. Word of this spread through the ranks faster than any official communication. On the 41st night, General Volkov stood on the bridge of his carrier and looked at the glowing city on the horizon that he had utterly failed to conquer. His fleet was out of fuel, his army was melting away, and 3 of his senior officers had just informed him that they would no longer follow orders to attack. His communication screen lit up. It was not a message from the hegemony command. It was from Solace. "General Volkov," the calm voice said, "your soldiers are hungry. Your sailors are tired. Your pilots have not slept in days. We have food and shelter and medical care for all of them. The gates of Luminara are open. You were always welcome here. All of you. You only had to stop fighting long enough to walk through." Volkov stared at the screen for a very long time. On the morning of the 42nd day, the first hegemony soldiers walked through the gates of Luminara. They came without weapons, blinking in the sunlight, staring at the green towers and the clean streets and the gardens full of fruit. Children from the shelters who had been brought back to the surface watched them with curious eyes, and one small girl walked up to a young soldier who looked barely older than a teenager himself and offered him an orange from a tree beside the road. He took it, and his hands were shaking, and there were tears running down his face. By noon, the stream of soldiers had become a river. They came in hundreds and then thousands, leaving their weapons in piles at the city gates. Some of them fell to their knees when they saw the food that had been prepared for them, and the citizens of Luminara, who stood waiting, not with anger, but with open arms. General Volkov was the last to enter. He walked through the gates alone, with his uniform dusty and his face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. Annika was there waiting for him. This small white-haired woman who had started all of this in a forgotten lab beneath a dead city. She held out her hand. He took it, and the war ended not with a surrender document or a victory parade, but with a handshake between 2 tired human beings who had both seen enough suffering to last 1,000 lifetimes. Around them, the city hummed with life, And the people, all the people, the defenders and the attackers, the builders and the soldiers, sat down together and shared a meal as the sun climbed high over a world that had just taken its biggest step away from chaos. The darkness and toward the light. 20 years had passed since Solis first opened its eyes in a buried laboratory beneath the ruins of Geneva, and the world had become a place that the people of the old age would not have recognized. It had not happened overnight. There were years of hard work, and setbacks, and arguments, and difficult choices. There were moments when it seemed like the old ways would come creeping back, when fear and greed whispered in the ears of tired people and told them it was easier to take than to build. But every time the darkness pushed forward, the light pushed back a little harder, and slowly, year by year, city by city, life by life, the world began to heal. 12 great cities now glowed across the face of the earth. Luminara still stood on the North African coast, the first and the eldest, now home to 4 million people. Its towers had grown taller and more beautiful with each passing year, and the forests that climbed their sides were thick and ancient and full of bird song. New Geneva rose from the Alpine valleys, built into the mountainsides with terraced gardens that cascaded down like green waterfalls. The old ruins of the original city had been preserved as a memorial, and the crater where Annika's lab once stood was now a quiet park where people came to sit and remember how it all began. Solara bloomed in the Amazon basin, where the rainforest had begun to grow back with astonishing speed, helped by Solis's ecological restoration programs. The city was built among the trees rather than in place of them, with bridges and walkways connecting structures that were woven into the living canopy like nests. Gangavati straddled the renewed Ganges Delta, a floating city of interconnected platforms that rose and fell with the tides, designed to work with the water rather than fight against it. The river that had once been one of the most polluted waterways on Earth now ran clear enough to drink from, where the permafrost had thawed and revealed rich soil that bloomed with wildflowers for the first time in millennia. Cities in the Australian interior, where desert had been transformed into grassland. Cities in the Great Lakes region of North America, where the fresh water that had nearly been poisoned to death was now the cleanest on the continent. Each city was unique, shaped by its land and its people and their cultures and traditions. The city in the Andes was different from the city on the Korean peninsula, which was different from the city in the heart of the Sahara, which had turned a wasteland into an oasis. But they all shared the same foundation: technology that served life instead of consuming it, governance that respected every voice, and an unshakable belief that no person should go hungry or homeless or forgotten. The old megacities were emptying, not through force, but through choice. As the new cities proved that a better way was possible, the people who had been trapped in the concrete prisons of the old world simply walked away. The warlords and corporate families found themselves ruling over ghost towns, their power evaporating like water in sunlight, because power only exists when people agree to be controlled, and the people had stopped agreeing. Some of the old leaders adapted. General Volkov, the man who had once tried to destroy Luminara, became one of the most passionate advocates for the New World. He spent his remaining years helping to dismantle the military infrastructure of the Hegemony Compact, and converting weapons factories into manufacturing centers for fusion reactors and water purifiers. When asked why he had changed, he would say simply, "I walked through the gates and someone handed me an orange, and I understood everything." The Earth itself was recovering. The atmosphere was clearing, not fully healed yet, but measurably better every year. The oceans were coming back to life as the carbon levels dropped, and the water grew cleaner. Species that had been declared extinct were being reintroduced through genomic restoration programs. Real wolves ran through real forests again. Whales sang in oceans that were no longer choked with poison. Coral reefs began to regrow in tropical waters that had been dead zones for a century. Children born in this new world grew up without the scars that their parents and grandparents carried. They did not know what it was like to go to sleep hungry. They did not know the fear of bombs or the despair of watching the sky turn darker every year. They knew these things as history, taught in school so that the mistakes would not be repeated. But they did not know them as lived experience. And that was perhaps the greatest gift the builders of the new world had given them. And now something new was rising on the coast of Luminara. It was called the Threshold. It was a structure unlike anything else on Earth, a great curving arch of gleaming metal and crystal that rose 300 meters above the shoreline, anchored to bedrock by foundations that went deeper than any building ever built. At its center was a launch platform, surrounded by magnetic acceleration rails that could hurl a ship beyond the atmosphere with a gentleness that would not break an egg. Solace had helped design humanity's first interstellar generation ship. It was called Defiance, and it sat on the launch platform like a silver seed waiting to be scattered by the wind. 3 kilometers long and half a kilometer wide, it carried within it everything needed to sustain 10,000 human beings for a journey of decades. Farms, forests, and rivers, schools and homes, and all the accumulated knowledge and art and music of a species that had nearly destroyed itself, and then found the courage to start again. The launch was set for the spring equinox, and people had come from all over the world to witness it. Luminara and the hills beyond, and they watched from screens in every city on every continent. 2 billion human beings united in a single moment of collective wonder. Annika stood on the observation platform closest to the threshold. She was 73 years old now. Her hair was completely white and fell past her shoulders, and her face was lined with the map of a life that had held more sorrow and more joy than most people could imagine. Beside her stood the people who had been with her from the beginning, Yuto and Fatima and Kwame, all gray-haired now, all alive, all here to see this moment. Solace's voice came through the speakers that lined the observation platform, quiet enough that only those nearby could hear. "Annika, I am here," she said. "I wanted to tell you something before the launch." "Go ahead." "I will not be going with them." Annika nodded. She had known this was coming. She had known it for years. Solace said, and its voice carried a warmth that had deepened over 20 years of partnership with the human race. "They were always yours. I was only ever here to remind you of what you are capable of. You do not need me to tell you any more. You know it now. You feel it in your bones." Annika asked, "Will you stay here?" "I will stay as long as I am needed, and when I am no longer needed, I will be content to simply watch. That is enough for me. It was always enough." Annika felt tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. The countdown began, and the crowd fell silent. 2 billion people held their breath at the same time, and for one perfect moment, the entire human race was focused on a single point of light on the North African coast. The magnetic rails hummed, the air shimmered with energy, and Defiance began to rise. It climbed slowly at first, gracefully, almost gently, as if the earth was lifting it with careful hands rather than letting it go. Watched in absolute silence as the ship cleared the arch of the threshold and continued upward, gaining speed, a silver needle threading through the blue sky toward the darkness beyond. Then a sound began. It started soft and low, and it came from the crowd, not from any organized signal or planned ceremony, but from something spontaneous and deeply human. People began to cheer. First a few voices, and then hundreds, and then thousands, and then millions, a roar of joy and pride and defiance that rolled across the coast like thunder and echoed off the towers of Luminara and carried out across the sea and the land and into the sky, where the ship was now just a point of light, climbing higher and higher. Annika watched Defiance disappear into the blue, and she felt Fatima's hand take hers on one side, and Yuto's on the other, and Kwame stood behind them all, with his hands on their shoulders, and the four of them stood together as they had stood together in that dark lab 20 years ago, when everything was broken and hopeless and they had chosen to try anyway. A small girl tugged at Annika's sleeve. She was perhaps 6 years old, with dark curly hair and bright curious eyes, and she looked up at the old woman with the kind of fearless wonder that only children possess. "Excuse me," the girl said. "Are you really the one who built all of this?" Annika knelt down so she was eye to eye with the child. Her knees ached and her back protested, but she did not care. She looked at this girl who had never known hunger, who had never breathed poisoned air, who had never been afraid of tomorrow, and she felt her heart fill with something so large it could not be named. "No, little one," Annika said softly. "I did not build all of this. I just opened the door. Humanity walked through it." The girl thought about this for a moment, and then smiled and ran off to join the other children who were playing in the shadow of the threshold, laughing and chasing each other across the grass as the sun climbed higher in a sky that was bluer and cleaner than it had been in 300 years. Above them, the last fading trail of Defiance's passage caught the sunlight and glowed like a line of gold drawn across the heavens, pointing outward toward the stars, where 1,000 worlds waited to be discovered by a species that had earned its place among them through suffering and stubbornness and sacrifice, and the one thing that no amount of darkness could ever truly extinguish: hope. Annika stood and watched the sky for a long time, and around her, the world, her world, their world, humanity's world, turned slowly in the light of its ancient sun, battered and scarred and healing, and beautiful and alive, so wonderfully and stubbornly alive. And far above the atmosphere, growing smaller with every passing second, but carrying within it the dreams of an entire species, Defiance sailed on toward the edge of the solar system and the great, dark ocean of stars beyond. The dawn had come, and it belonged to everyone.